So here's a mechanism of speciation. Allopatric speciation is when you have a population and it is split and there's a barrier where each separate population is able to reproduce and accumulate differences over time. Later, those two populations might be reintroduced together, but so many differences between them have occurred that they can no longer reproduce. And there's a lot of examples of that. One great place to look for allopatric speciation is in South America. That's my field site, so of course I pull a lot of examples from that, but that's also a center of diversity for planet Earth. So if you want to understand animals, why not start where they are most diverse, equatorial tropical regions, and this is the Amazon basin here. So what would be a way of separating species in the Amazon basin? Well, why not that big river, the Amazon River? And sure enough, if you look on the north side of the Amazon and the south side of the Amazon, you'll find a lot of different species that are very similar to each other, but they've accumulated so many differences that now they can no longer reproduce. In this case, you have on the north side of the Amazon the dusky-throated antshrike up here, and on the south side you have the saturnine antshrike. And they look very, very similar. They actually sound very, very similar, but they're different species, and they've been separated for a very long time, likely by that Amazon River. So how do these geographic barriers occur? What does that mean? So mountains, as they rise up, they create differences in valleys and different peaks. A mountain rising up can actually split a population up. In this example, you can see there's an original population. There was some uplifting event, so some mountains kind of rose up from tectonic activity. Once they rose up, these high areas were not suitable for this species, and so it stopped occurring there. So then this original species got split up into three different groups. This one foothill population, this valley population, and then this opposite foothill population. Well, over time, those populations will accrue genetic differences, and eventually they'll be so different that they can't reproduce anymore. Now, the same can occur on the peaks of mountains. So in this case, there's a tectonic uplifting. The populations survived at this peak and at this peak, but in the valley it wasn't suitable. These became allopatric populations. The coasts, the foothills were no longer appropriate. And so now, over time, as you accumulate genetic differences, this peak has one species, and this peak has now become a new species. So based on that, you can make some guesses, some hypotheses, and generate some hypotheses about the kinds of diversity you might find in mountainous regions. So what do you think? Do you think you would have more or less diversity in an area that had more mountains and valleys? Let's look at this example of Adelomia hummingbirds in the Andes. In this example, you can see that along the Andean mountains, where you have a ton of different mountain peaks and a bunch of different valleys, you have also a huge diversification of these hummingbirds. Here you can see a cladogram illustrating the differences, and each one of these colors, each one of these colored clades corresponds with a different area in the Andean plateau or in the mountains or in the foothills. And you can see that this genetic diversity seems to also correspond with the geographic placement of these groups. So this group here is in one area, this group here is in another area. So species diversity can follow these kind of geographic patterns and almost represent it on a genetic level. So if you have allopatric speciation, where species diverge because they're separated by some geographic feature, you must have another case, sympatric speciation, where species diverge within the same area, where they're not separated geographically. And we call this sympatric speciation. Sympatric meaning they're co-occurring in the same place. So sympatric speciation can occur because of some polymorphism, some difference genetically that arises within some individuals in that population. And perhaps that polymorphism is selected for by either sexual selection or some other selective force. And then you have eventually the divergence of two genotypes that become so different over time that they can no longer reproduce or they no longer reproduce. So one example of that was the Mbuna, the cichlids from Lake Malawi. And those cichlids are co-occurring. They're in the same place, and maybe some individuals would be born with a brighter colored fin or a different color. Some females in that population would prefer that, and some wouldn't. And so then you had an event where two different genotypes were being selected for, and they would diverge from there until eventually they no longer reproduced. There was no genetic material moving between those populations to the point where genetic differences would accumulate, and eventually you'd have two populations that don't reproduce anymore, and you have a new species. And that seems to have happened a bunch in Lake Malawi. This example of sympatric speciation is really incredible because you can see all the different morphologies, the different colors, and there's just a ton of really beautiful fish there. So another example of sympatric speciation comes from the neotropics, the South American forests near the Amazon. There you find Hypocnemis peruviana and Hypocnemis cantator. And these two species, they look very similar. In fact, they're very closely related, but they have slightly different preferences in habitat. And what you find is that they mimic each other's calls. They sound very similar. Females can actually tell the difference. So the males will fight each other regardless of whether it's a Hypocnemis peruviana or a Hypocnemis cantator. The males will fight each other using the same similar sounding songs. But the females can tell, and they can tell well enough to make sure that there is a prezygotic barrier. It maintains that genetic isolation between these two species. They can co-occur very close to each other. So you could have Hypocnemis peruviana on one side of a trail, and then on the other side of the trail you could have Hypocnemis cantator. They can occur that close, but they have those prezygotic barriers in place, which is in this case the selection abilities and the hearing abilities of the females in the population. So let's take a look at an interesting example and play with kind of the concepts that we've learned so far. So here we have a species of salamander, or this is actually a genus of salamander. See how it's italicized and we have the capital E. So we're talking about a genus here, and this is Encetina. Now, Encetina is found throughout the Pacific Northwest, and there's a bunch of different species. Now, Encetina are very interesting because they're very closely related. If you look here, we have Encetina schultzii here on the coast. Just north of this population of Encetina schultzii, you have Encetina xanthoptica, and that's right here, and it looks like there's a little split here. North of that, you have Encetina oregensis, a little bit of Encetina picta, and then here in the Sierra Nevadas, you have Encetina platensis. And finally, south of the platensis population, you have Encetina cruciator, and then down here you have Encetina kluberi. Remember our definition of the biological species was whether or not individuals could reproduce and have viable offspring in a natural setting. Well, with Encetina, what you find is that these two different species here, they hybridize. So sometimes if you're here in this area, you'll actually find hybrids between Xanthoptica and schultzii. That's actually very near here. And sometimes you'll find hybrids up in this northern area of Xanthoptica and oregonensis. Over here, sometimes you find hybrids of oregonensis and platensis. And if you keep going down, sometimes you'll find hybrids over here, cruciator and platensis. But Encetina cruciator does not hybridize with Encetina schultzii. You might want to generate a hypothesis as to why that might be. Why do you think that would be occurring? What history do you think occurred with the genus Encetina that created a situation where all of these populations could reproduce with each other to some degree? You could form hybrids. But in this last little part here, these two these two populations, which are very close to each other and might co-occur, they for some reason cannot hybridize. We call this a ring species. And a ring species is a species or a group of species who seem to have moved across a landscape. And at some point, they actually met back up with that original population. But because that movement across the landscape accrued so many changes in their genes, in their gene pool, once they meet up again, they're so different that they can no longer reproduce. But if you follow the populations back, they can reproduce with the next and the next and the next all the way back.
The best guess we have is that the population started in the Pacific Northwest and started to migrate down into California. As the populations neared the Central Valley, where it's dry, the population split into a coastal mountain population and a Sierra Nevadas population. As they kept moving down, those two populations started to evolve separately, and their allele frequencies began to change at different rates. The coastal population is sympatric with another species of salamander, which has a lot of toxicity. Their color morphology started to match that salamander, while the Sierra Nevada mountain population started to evolve more blotches and probably accumulated a lot of other differences. By the time the two groups met down in the Palomar Mountains, the species can no longer interbreed.
That's a really cool example of how genes and landscapes can interact in a way that creates an interesting story and also blurs the line in what we consider a species.